So here's a scene from Washington that you probably saw. A congresswoman sits across from the Secretary of Defense in a congressional hearing room. She is not some freshman who wandered into the wrong committee. She's Chrissy Houlahan, Air Force veteran, member of the House Armed Services Committee, a woman who actually wore the uniform. She leans forward, and she says 5 words that turned that hearing into the most shared clip of the afternoon. Answer: the question. The question was about a general, a 4-star general named Charles Q. Brown, Jr., combat pilot, Pacific commander, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the second black officer in American history to hold the position that reports directly to the President of the United States. He had given 4 decades to this country's military, and Pete Hegseth, roughly 6 weeks into his job as Secretary of Defense, fired him. Houlahan wanted Hegseth to justify that decision. On camera, in front of the country. Answer the question. The clip ran on every network that afternoon. Half the country cheered her for it. And if that's where this story ends, Hegseth looks evasive and Brown looks like a victim of political retribution. But here's what nobody said when they were sharing that clip. There is one number buried in the Pentagon's own official records from Brown's time in command, and that number is the answer to the question Houlahan should have been asking all along. Because this story doesn't begin in that committee room. It begins in a recruiting station that couldn't fill its quota. To understand what Houlahan was actually demanding in that committee room, you need to know who she was defending. General Charles Q. Brown, Jr. had given his entire adult life to the Air Force. He flew F-16 Fighting Falcons in combat. He commanded Pacific Air Forces during one of the most strategically complex periods in American history, watching China build out its Navy in real time, managing alliances across the Pacific with fewer resources than anyone wanted to admit. When Joe Biden nominated him to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs in 2023, it was historic. Only the second black officer to hold that position, following Colin Powell 30 years earlier. Brown was not a desk general. He had the operational record, he had the hardware, he had the credibility. And Hegseth, who had barely finished unpacking at the Pentagon when Brown got the call, was not exactly a bipartisan darling to begin with. The Senate vote to confirm him was 50-50. Vice President J.D. Vance broke the tie. The narrowest confirmation margin for a Secretary of Defense in modern American history. Democrats had made clear from day one that they viewed his presence in the building as illegitimate. 6 weeks later, the most senior military officer in the country was fired. So when Houlahan got Hegseth into that committee room, she wasn't asking a procedural question. She wanted him on the record. What did Brown do wrong? Give us a specific failure. Give us a specific breach of command. Give us something beyond vague language about priorities. Hegseth's answer pointed to the need for military leadership focused on war fighting, on lethality, on mission alignment with the administration's vision for what the military should be. Houlahan wasn't accepting that. She pushed. Answer: the question. The cameras got every second of it. The clip was turned into something that felt like a verdict. And here's the honest thing. Is that a reasonable demand? Not entirely unreasonable. If you remove a 40-year veteran with a distinguished operational record, you owe the country more than policy alignment. That's a fair position. But here's where it gets complicated. Because the specifics Houlahan was demanding, they exist. They're in the Pentagon's own official records, in recruiting data, in readiness assessments, in numbers generated not under Hegseth's watch, but under Brown's. Numbers that were sitting on the Armed Services Committee's desk as they developed. Numbers Houlahan had access to. The question she was pressing Hegseth to answer? He was pointing directly at it. She just wasn't listening to where the answer led. Because where it leads requires looking at what Brown was actually doing when he was running the United States military. And that part of the story is where this gets genuinely uncomfortable. So what was General Brown's Pentagon actually focused on? Here's where it gets complicated. Not because Brown is a bad person. By every account, he is exactly what he appears to be. A decorated officer, a combat veteran, a man who rose to the most senior military position in the country through 40 years of genuine service. But what he chose to make his public priority during that tenure tells you something specific about where the institutional attention was pointed. Start in June 2020. George Floyd has just died. The country is convulsing. Brown, at that point serving as Air Force Chief of Staff, the most senior officer in the entire Air Force, records a video and posts it to official Air Force channels. Official Air Force channels. He speaks about his experience as a black man in America. He talks about racial inequality. He talks about what he is personally thinking and feeling in that moment. The video circulates for years afterward. It defines his public profile more than any combat record or operational achievement. Millions of Americans come to know who CQ Brown is from that video, not from the F-16 cockpit. Now here's a question worth sitting with. Was that a personal statement or an official one? The answer, it was posted to official Air Force channels using official resources from the desk of the Air Force's most senior officer. That is not a small distinction. For a four-star general to post personal political commentary on official government platforms means the Air Force's institutional voice was, in effect, aligned with his personal views. That question was raised publicly at the time. It never got a clear answer. It was never raised in an answer-the-question-style congressional hearing. Meanwhile, the Biden administration was expanding diversity, equity, and inclusion infrastructure across the military at a pace the department had never seen before. DEI officer positions across every service branch, DEI curriculum woven into leadership training programs, hundreds of full-time DEI-related roles created within the Department of Defense. The Biden administration had directed this expansion across the federal government, and the military implemented it. Brown, as the nation's most senior uniformed officer after 2023, was publicly aligned with this direction. He did not resist it. He embodied it. The Army acknowledged recruiting shortfalls in 2022. Officials told Congress the pipeline was being worked on. They said conditions were stabilizing. They said they had a plan. So here's the only question that matters. Did it work? That answer is in the official record, in a specific year, with specific numbers. Numbers so stark that they should have generated their own congressional hearing, their own answer the question moment from a veteran congresswoman who cares deeply about the military. And they didn't. What those fiscal year 2023 numbers actually show is where this goes from a story about priorities to a genuine national security crisis. Let's talk about the number. This is the part of the story that didn't get 10 seconds of airtime the afternoon Houlahan's clip was running on every network. And it is the most important fact in this entire discussion. Fiscal year 2023. The United States Army, the nation's largest military branch, the ground force responsible for deterring land threats across the globe, missed its annual recruiting goal by approximately 15,000 soldiers. 15,000 in 1 year. Military readiness experts and defense analysts described it as the worst Army recruiting shortfall since the all-volunteer force replaced the Vietnam-era draft. 50 years. The worst in 50 years. Sit with that number for a moment. 15,000 unfilled positions. Not in a peaceful world with no strategic adversaries. In an era when China was announcing consecutive years of defense budget increases, when military analysts across the political spectrum were issuing warnings about a 2027 to 2030 readiness window. The critical period when Chinese military capabilities could challenge American deterrence in the Pacific. Military readiness experts will tell you a recruiting gap doesn't just hurt the force this year. A unit that deploys understaffed struggles. A training pipeline running below capacity builds experience more slowly. A readiness gap of this scale takes a decade to recover from in the field. And General Charles Q. Brown, Jr. was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when those numbers were compiled. The nation's most senior military officer. The man Chrissy Houlahan is defending. The man she cornered Hegseth about. Here's the thing worth sitting with. The Pentagon did not hide these recruiting figures. Army recruiting leadership testified in open hearings. The data appeared in annual readiness submissions to Congress. Every member of the Armed Services Committee, every member, including Chrissy Houlahan, had access to those numbers as they were developing. So here's the question. Did any of them call the nation's top military officer into a committee room and demand he answer for 15,000 empty recruiting slots? Did any of them lean forward and say, "Answer the question, where did the soldiers go?" You already know the answer, because here's what those years looked like from inside the institution. The same Pentagon that was running hundreds of full-time DEI positions was presenting Congress with recruiting numbers it hadn't seen in half a century. The same civilian and military leadership that had aligned the military's public identity with DEI expansion was simultaneously briefing Congress about quotas that weren't being filled. Those two facts existed in the same building, at the same time, under the same leadership. And the response was not to change course. It was to maintain direction and wait for the numbers to improve. They didn't. And the most damning acknowledgement of what was happening in that Pentagon during this period didn't come from a Republican, didn't come from Trump, didn't come from Hegseth. It came from someone Houlahan would never think to put in that hearing room chair. Biden's own Secretary of Defense, the man who personally recommended Brown for the CJCS position. And what he told Congress about those recruiting numbers is something Houlahan has never once cited in her attacks on Hegseth. Because that acknowledgement changes the entire meaning of the hearing clip you saw. Who was it? Someone who held 4 stars. Someone who was inside that building while every one of those recruiting reports was being written and submitted to Congress. Someone who served in Biden's cabinet for 4 full years. Someone from the same party as Chrissy Houlahan. Someone she has never once called to a congressional committee to answer the question about the numbers his department was generating. His name is Lloyd Austin, former 4-star Army general, Biden's Secretary of Defense, the first Black Secretary of Defense in American history, the man who recommended C.Q. Brown to serve as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, Austin acknowledged that the Army's recruiting situation represented one of the most serious challenges facing the Department of Defense. Not a minor operational hiccup, not something being managed smoothly. One of the most serious challenges in the department. Austin's words, Biden's own man, the person who was running the Pentagon during the years those DEI programs were expanding and those recruiting numbers were collapsing. Now here's the complete picture, because it forms one clear line. Houlahan stands in that committee room and demands Hegseth explain why a decorated general was fired. But what was happening inside that decorated general's institution while he was at the top? The military was running hundreds of full-time DEI officer positions. The Air Force Chief of Staff was using official government platforms to post personal statements about racial inequality. The Army was missing its annual recruiting goal by the largest margin in 50 years. And Biden's own Secretary of Defense, the man who elevated Brown to the CJCS chair, was telling Congress the situation was one of the most serious challenges facing the department. They knew. The civilian and military leadership of that Pentagon knew. The data was briefed to Congress. Austin acknowledged it publicly. The Armed Services Committee had access to the readiness reports. And the institutional response was not to change course. The DEI programs continued. The messaging continued. The same direction held. And the Army came up approximately 15,000 soldiers short. Now Hegseth comes in. He fires the leadership that presided over all of it. He points to the military's need for a lethality-first culture as the reason. He says the direction has to change. And Houlahan, who sat on the Armed Services Committee while every one of those recruiting reports was being submitted, who never once held a answer the question hearing about 15,000 empty slots, puts herself in front of a camera and demands accountability. For the firing, not for what preceded it. And here's the thing about the answer Hegseth was giving in that committee room. He was answering. The answer was pointing at exactly what Austin had already told Congress, that the institution had a serious problem. Accepting his answer just requires acknowledging what produced the problem, and that's the piece of this story that's been sitting in the official record the whole time. And here it is. Not the evasive non-answer Houlahan accused Hegseth of giving. The actual answer. The one that's been in the official record since before that hearing ever happened. The United States Army missed its recruiting goal by approximately 15,000 soldiers in fiscal year 2023. The worst shortfall in 50 years. General Brown was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Biden's own Secretary of Defense. Lloyd Austin, the man who put Brown in that chair, told the Senate Armed Services Committee that recruiting was among the most serious challenges facing the department. And the Armed Services Committee, where Chrissy Houlahan holds a seat, had access to that data as it developed. So when Houlahan leaned forward and said, "Answer the question," Hegseth was answering. He was pointing to a military leadership culture that prioritized DEI programs over readiness benchmarks, that produced the numbers Austin himself flagged as a serious problem, that presided over the worst Army recruiting year in half a century. That is not evasion. That is an indictment of the record she went on national television to defend. You now know more about what happened in that committee room than every person who shared that clip online. You know what the question was actually pointing at. You know what the answer was actually saying. And you know why that moment landed very differently for anyone who knew those recruiting numbers than for anyone who didn't. Here's the bottom line. A decorated general was fired. The person who fired him pointed to institutional failures that Biden's own defense secretary had already acknowledged to Congress. And a congresswoman with genuine military credentials put herself on camera as the face of the resistance, without ever once directing that same energy at the 15,000 families of soldiers who wanted to serve and couldn't get through the door. If you want to catch the next breakdown the moment it drops, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, and drop a comment below. When did it click for you? Was it the number? Was it Austin? Because I want to leave you right where we started. That committee room. Chrissy Houlahan leaning forward. Answer the question. He answered. She just didn't want to hear where it pointed.